Good morning, Crossing Church. How are you doing this morning? It's good to see you. What a great day. What a glorious day. I'm glad that we get to experience the joy of the Lord together today. I want to welcome all of our campuses. So if you're in Macomb, Kirksville, 929, Pittsfield, Hannibal, Lima, Mount Sterling, or Keokuk, we are so glad that you're joining us this first service. And if you're joining online and you'd like to do something more substantial than just to watch, but to gather people in your home and become a Crossing location, we want you to log on to thecrossing.tv because there's this exciting thing that we're going to start in March, and we want you to be a part of it. So take a look at that and experience that. I think God could do incredible things. You know, last week, we learned that God is a generous God, and He's been a generous God to us. Last week, we had 7,055 people in all of our locations, our second highest attendance. And I was doing some statistics stuff this week, and in the last 2 years, we have baptized more than in the previous 10 years combined. It's like God's a generous God. He has been providing for us, and that's why we're in this series. It's called Contagious Generosity, and we want to reflect the generosity of God out to all of you. And so we want you to get this book. It's by Barry Cameron, the same guy that wrote the ABCs of financial freedom. And this is free to you at all of our locations. At all 9 locations, you can pick one of these up in the lobby and take it home and read it. That's what we ask you to do, because it's going to help you to understand in a much deeper and more profound way just how generous God is. And that's what we learned last week, that our God is a generous God. It's His nature to be a generous God. When you think about all that He has given us and all that He has provided for us, and He calls us the children of God. And so it seems normal, doesn't it, that we should reflect the nature of our God, of our Heavenly Father, and that we should have a nature to be generous. And generosity it's contagious. It's an absolutely contagious thing, because once we're generous, then other people are blessed by that, and it kind of fuels their generosity. And what I want to do today is I want to start off with an illustration of how that actually works in real time. The reason that the Crossing has been able to do what it's been able to do has a big part of that is people at other Christian churches like ours that pooled their money together and invested it. And then those investments we ended up using as a loan, and it helped us when we were weaker and more struggling to get to the next level. And now we have people at the Crossing at all of our locations that are making those investments right now for other churches to be able to get to the next level themselves. And that whole concept is called a church extension fund. And you know, when God does things, when He's working, and there's no doubt that we get to experience the fact that God's working in our midst, He has people placed strategically all around, and He pulls those people together to make things happen, to build His kingdom. And the illustration of contagious generosity that I want to share with you today is one of those people, because we've experienced that. And he's kind of an unsung hero, but he's here today, and I want to introduce him to you. See, there was a time, and it hasn't been that long ago, when the Crossing struggled financially. I can remember in the summers, we used to do these blue envelopes. I don't know if you remember that, just to try to make it through the summer, the leaner months of the year. Well, that's definitely been a thing in our past. And I remember back in 2006, 2007, we were building the Macomb campus, our first multi-site. We thought that $1 million would handle that site, and we underestimated it by about $500,000. And we went back to the bank and we said, hey, we're going to need a little bit more to complete this. And they hadn't loaned the original money, but we asked them to help complete it. And they were reluctant. They were reluctant to lend us any. And it was an interesting time because God, he has a plan for his people. And I got an invitation to go to a luncheon at the North American. This was in 2006, to go to the North American that Doug Crozier was hosting. And it was at that luncheon, after the luncheon, I talked to him and I told him our situation as a church, and he listened to where we were. And he was a Southern California guy, and he came in the dead of winter across the frozen tundra of Illinois, and came out here to Quincy where the highway ends, and saw what we were doing out here in a place that people probably wouldn't expect to find a group of mega churches. And I got something completely different from him. He said, "You guys are the best kept secret in the whole country. It's amazing what God is doing here. And instead of wanting to help you out with the $500,000 that you need to finish Macomb, I want all of your loans. We want to be part of the ministry that God is doing here, and we'll fund your next 10 locations." And I remember thinking he was crazy. 10 locations? Well, we're at 9. We're at 9. We would have never thought that at the time. And ever since that, over the last 9 years, Doug and the Solomon Foundation, they've been our partners in ministry. It was Doug that introduced me to Jim Putman. He says, "Hey, I got a guy that you need to meet." And it was because of Jim Putman that our whole trajectory of relational discipleship, all of our discipleship, all 10 of our discipleship pastors all over our campuses, that's what that all translates back to. That introduction with Jim Putman completely revolutionized our attitude toward discipleship. And he introduced me to Barry Cameron. And how much of a change have we experienced because of understanding stewardship and generosity through his teaching and the relationship with him? How awesome is that? He's invited me to tell the story of the crossing all over the country, and it's impacted so many churches. I've had so many church leaders that have just showed up here, and they said, "Hey, tell me how you do this, and show us how you do that." And then that's been reproduced in churches all over the country. His organization has saved us hundreds of thousands of dollars in interest, maybe even over $1 million in interest, which is pretty amazing. And he's been encouraging us on how to eliminate debt altogether. And we're well on our way to that. The Solomon Foundation has granted us, just given us $45,000 over the last, I'd say, 3 years. And we've used that to build the outdoor playgrounds at our locations. Isn't that cool? So many different things that have happened. And now, because of all the health that we have financially, we've kind of moved slowly from the borrower to the lender. And now the crossing has over $2 million invested in the Solomon Foundation, the individuals that are part of the crossing. All of our full-time employees have retirement benefits now through that. We would have never thought we could offer retirement or full health care, which is something that we can do now because we're so much healthier financially. And I don't think that kind of stuff happens without God placing key people in our path at the right time. And then us developing that relationship. And that's who Doug Crozier's been to me, and that's who he's been to the crossing. You don't know him, but I want to introduce him to you. So I want you to give a crossing welcome to Doug Crozier. Would you do that?
Thanks, buddy.
What I want to do is I want to ask Doug a few questions just to help you guys understand what it is that this ministry does called the Solomon Foundation. I've been the chairman for the last 2 years. Now I'm just a board member. I'm just a regular lackey, but it's been amazing. It's not something that I do for money. It's a nonprofit organization, and we aren't paid to be a part of it, but the ministry that is accomplished through it is absolutely incredible. And the technical term of the Solomon Foundation is called a CEF, or a Church Extension Fund. So Doug, would you explain what that actually is?
Well, first of all, I want to thank the Crossing for allowing Jerry to serve on our board and to help churches all across the United States. It's been a great opportunity. So Jerry, thank you for for serving on our board. A church extension fund is a rather unique story. In 1933, after the Great Depression of 1929, all the securities laws were rewritten in this country. And that law was probably about this thick, but there was one paragraph in that law that allowed denominations or affiliated group of churches to form a church extension fund. And that was the birthing of what is about 50 different funds in the United States that help churches all across the country.
And so what a church extension fund does is it takes in investments of its members, and then it loans that out to churches or ministries to be able to help them get to the next level, right?
Correct. It's real simple. We just take in the investments or the deposits. We then take that money, and then we help churches build facilities all across the United States and now around the world.
Just like this one, because that's how this one was built, and some of our others. That's how they were funded as well. So we have a special story at the Solomon Foundation. We're the fastest growing CEF in the history of CEF. So I want you to explain a little bit about that.
Well, we started the Solomon Foundation just over 3.5 years ago, and God has blessed us tremendously. We actually opened in April of 2011, and it was rather interesting that the first day we opened, we brought in $37 million of investments or deposits the first day, and we hadn't even opened our new office in Denver, Colorado, so we had to open our church extension fund in one of our regional offices called Starbucks. And from there, the Solomon Foundation has grown to $180 million, and we've helped over 80 churches in 25 states and 2 foreign countries.
It's amazing. That's awesome. We really only do 2 things, though, right? We only do 2 things. What are those 2 things?
Well, you know, the NFL playoffs are going on right now, and it's very simple. The Solomon Foundation does 2 things very well. We block and we tackle. And the basic concept is we bring in deposits and we make loans to churches.
And we have 5 core values at the Solomon Foundation. We honor God, that's number 1, right? We point people to Jesus Christ, number 2. We give a great return to our investors, number 3. Number 4, we help churches get to the next level. And my favorite is number 5, we have a lot of fun. And we really do, because to witness what God does through this process of contagious generosity that actually happens from church to church as the kingdom grows is incredible. I want to focus on the 4th one, helping churches get to the next level. How important is that across the country?
It's incredibly important, because what happens is 90% of churches in America cannot get a bank loan. So what that means is churches, to get new facilities built, they have to find an alternative source of capital, and that's what we are. So it's really paramount that the church extension fund can get out there and help churches, because, you know, the Crossing can now get a bank loan. In fact, the Crossing has a bank loan, and the neat thing is that's great, because then they pay us back off and we go help more churches. And we're a little bit different than the bank is. We actually want our churches to pay off their debt. So it's a rather unique situation.
Now, we've got a ton of win stories, and that's probably the most fun part, is to see how God impacts all of these churches. You mentioned Poland. I'd like for you to share that. But share that and a couple of other stories that are just special to you, where God's been able to use this organization to really impact churches.
Well, when we first started the Solomon Foundation, I got a call from a pastor in Michigan. And he was sitting in his car in the parking lot. They were trying to buy a 74,000 square foot closed indoor tennis facility to convert it to a church. And he'd just been turned down by another institution. And he called me in tears and he says, "We just need someone to help us." So we flew out to Detroit, helped them acquire this building. They were running 1,500 in a local high school, had never had a permanent facility. And now 2 years later, they average 5,100 people every Sunday.
Yeah, it's awesome.
Just an incredible story. I think one I want to share with you that's it's very unique is that about 6 months ago, we had a parachurch ministry call us called Streetlight. in Phoenix. It was started by one of our churches, Christ Church of the Valley in Peoria, Arizona. And it's a ministry that reaches out and brings young girls 15 to 18 off the streets from prostitution. They called us, and the person that held the mortgage on their property was going to call the note and was going to try to move them out of this facility. We stepped in, made the loan so that they could continue the ministry of helping bringing young girls off the streets, showing them who Jesus is, and turning their lives around.
It's like hundreds. There's like hundreds
of girls.
Of girls that are in the...
Yeah, it's a model program for all across the United States, and the Solomon Foundation was able to step in and help them do that.
And we just funded the largest Protestant church in the whole country of Poland, in Warsaw, Poland. Runs 1,000 people. And when you see their worship, it looks just like the Crossing, except for a different language.
Different language.
Lots of K's and Z's and X's and. But yeah, it's like I don't know. But it's incredible to see what God's doing, and I wish we could take the whole time to just talk about these win stories, because it's been awesome. It's been an awesome experience. But I want you to think about this. You know, I know some of us. We're just still trying to get a handle on our finances and stewardship. But many of us have gotten to the place where we can be in the contagious generosity category, working on a retirement. We're doing stuff like that. But you tell me, where's a place that you can receive a return on your investment, and that the investment is doing this incredible work for the kingdom of God? I just feel like there's room in our plans and in our future plans for like the Solomon Foundation, because it's just incredible what you're able to experience and see how God experiences it, and we have been the benefactor of so much of that, and now we get to pay that forward. We get to be the ones that are contagiously generous, but a lot of that has to do with key people like Doug Crozier. Would you thank him along with me for his help? Thank you, Doug.
Thanks, Jerry.
Last night my son Joey was at Mount Sterling, and they were, they're watching online, and they saw us hug, and they hashtag awkward hug. So we've been working on our hug. Anyway. I just want to thank Doug, and I want to thank the whole Solomon Foundation team for the way that they've just really blessed us. But what I want you to learn from that illustration is that generosity is contagious. It's designed to be contagious. I've experienced it that myself. But when I used to be the pastor at Roachdale, Indiana, we used to go to a thing in Indianapolis called the Praise Gathering of Believers. And you had reserved seats. It was about 11,000 people. And it was a lot of worship and praise. It was awesome. But I happened to be sitting, our reserved seats were around a whole lot of fuddy-duddies. Like Frozen Chosen. They just sat there. And it was depressing. And we were trying to worship God, and they were kind of, So we went to the Circle Center Mall for supper in Indianapolis, and they had one of those stores where you could buy candy in bulk. How many of you seen those stores before? We bought 10 pounds of bulk candy, every kind of candy, and we carried like these 10 pounds of bags of candy back into the praise gathering, and because I thought there might be a way that we could kind of help these people that were sitting around us get a little more engaged. And, we were the first ones back, and we're sitting there in our seat, and here they start coming. And when they started to fill in, we said, hey, you want some candy? And they went, well, what do you got? And so I go, we got a pound of this, we got a pound of that, we got 2 pounds of that, we got a pound. And it wasn't any time. People started coming in. Candy started getting handed out. Everything started to change. Everybody is sharing candy with other people. Before long, most of the candy was gone, and the praise went way up. There's something contagious about generosity. I remember going to a Promise Keepers event in northern Indiana, and I was riding with my friend Ray. You hear about my friend Ray a lot. We were in a big truck. There was a lot of guys in that truck. And so we pull up, and even though the event had been paid for, we had to pay for parking. It was $10. And the guys in our truck were complaining, that's a lot of money parking. And there's, Ray goes, I want to pay for ours and the guy behind us. And the people in the in the truck with him, we're going, we don't even know that guy behind us. He goes, yeah, isn't that great? So he paid for our parking and the parking of the stranger behind us. So the next guy came up. You know what the conversation was. That guy up there, he paid your parking. You can go on. What? I don't even know that guy. Yeah. Okay. Well, I'll pay for the parking for the guy behind me. For the next hour and a half, nobody at that Promise Keepers event paid their own parking. They always paid the parking for the person behind them. And it changed the entire attitude of that Promise Keepers event from the very beginning. That's what contagious generosity does. In the Old Testament, in the book of Exodus, the Israelites are complaining. They're in the middle of the desert. Now, they've got a lot to be thankful for because God has delivered them out of the hands of their oppressors, bondage in Egypt. He's shown himself in such powerful and profound ways, obviously with all the plagues that were responsible for delivering them. They've actually walked through the Red Sea that's parted on both sides. Now they're in the desert and they're complaining. You know why? Because they're hungry. And they say, there was pots of boiled meat, in Egypt. And if we could only go back there and eat what we had. And God heard their complaining. And this is what he said about it in Exodus 16, verses 4 and 5. It says, the Lord said to Moses, I will rain down bread from heaven for you. The people are to go out each day and gather enough for that day. In this way, I will test them and see whether they follow my instructions. On the sixth day, they are to prepare what they bring in, and that is to be twice as much as they gather on the other days. God made it rain bread from heaven. And not only did he do that, but he sent quail in the evening. So all these quail would come down and land in the middle of the desert and say, would you please pick me up and eat me? And then this rain there would be this dew that would come down from heaven, and then when the dew would dry out, it would leave this bread. And they could go out and they could gather it up. Now God had a rule, and that was you can only gather what you're going to use for the day. Not for 2 days, not for 4 days. There can't be any manna banks around here. We can't loan manna or, charge interest on manna. Just, get your manna for the day. Except on Friday, when you could gather 2 days worth of manna, because he didn't want you working on the Sabbath day. And the people had bread from heaven. It was like sugary wafers. And then they had quail in the evening every single day. Isn't it amazing how God provides? But I want you to understand the contagiously generous nature of God. He's completely generous. He provides for his people, but he only provides enough for 1 day. And you think about, well, why would he do that? Well, God wants us to know that he's there to supply our needs and that I need to trust him. And that's not just a one-time event. I need to trust him every single day. That's what we learned in the ABCs of financial freedom, that we have to learn to turn that over to the Lord and trust him because he is trustworthy. That's why we're offering Financial Peace University now. We have over 100 families that have already enrolled in that because we need to learn how to do that every day. But we can see the generosity of God in it. It's amazing. But what about when God doesn't show up? There's stories in the Bible of God not showing up. And I would imagine there's some of you that would say, hey, that's great, that whole manna story, but, you don't know my situation. Or you don't know my close friend's situation. I mean, we've been praying for God to show up, and we haven't seen anything. What about when that happens? What do I do then? There's some great stories in the Old Testament about that. And the first one I want to point you to is in 1 Kings chapter 17. It's about a widow from a place called Zarephath. Let's read it together, starting in verse 7. It says, sometime later, the brook dried up because there had been no rain in the land. Then the word of the Lord came to him, go at once to Zarephath of Sidon and stay there. I've commanded a widow in that place to supply you with food. So he went to Zarephath, and this is Elijah, the prophet, by the way. He went to Zarephath, And when he came to the town gate, a widow was there gathering sticks. He called to her and asked, "Would you bring me a little water in a jar so I may have a drink?" And as she was going to get it, he called, "And bring me, please, a piece of bread." Now, I want to stop right there. That's just plain rotten. See, this woman is getting ready to eat her last meal and then die. And the prophet of God is saying, "Hey, would you just go get me some food and something to drink and bring it to me so I can eat it in front of you?" Why would God do a thing like that? That just sounds cruel, doesn't it? Verse 17, "As surely as the Lord your God lives," she replied, "I don't have any bread, only a handful of flour in a jar and a little oil in a jug. And I am gathering a few sticks to take home and make a meal for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die." That's how bad things were. Elijah said to her, "Don't be afraid. Go home and do as you have said. But first, make a small cake of bread for me from what you have and bring it to me. And then make some for yourself and for your son. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. The jar of flour will not be used up, and the jug of oil will not run dry until the day the Lord gives rain on the land." So she went away and did as Elijah told her, and there was food every day for Elijah and for the woman and her family. For the jar of flour was not used up, the jug of oil did not run dry, in keeping with the word of the Lord spoken by Elijah. So God says, even in the midst of poverty, practice generosity. Because when generosity happens, then you really get to see God do something amazing. There's another story, very similar to this story, that happened with Elijah's protege. And his name was Elisha, very close in names. And we read about that in 2 Kings chapter 4. Let's read that together. It says, "The wife of a man from the company of the prophets cried out to Elisha, 'Your servant, my husband, is dead, and you know that he revered the Lord. But now his creditor is coming to take my 2 boys as his slaves.' Elisha replied to her, 'How can I help you? Tell me, what do you have in your house?'" I want to stop there. Isn't it interesting that Elijah answers her poverty by asking her what she has? Doesn't immediately say, "Here's what I can give you," but asks her what she has. We move on. She says, "Your servant has nothing there at all," she said, "except a little oil." Elisha said, "Go around and ask all your neighbors for empty jars. Don't ask for just a few. Then go inside and shut the door behind you and your sons. Pour oil into all the jars, and as each is filled, put it to one side." She left him and afterwards shut the door behind her and her sons, and they brought the jars to her, and she kept pouring. And when all the jars were full, she said to her son, "Bring me another one." But he replied, "There is not a jar left." Then the oil stopped flowing. And she went and told the man of God, and he said, "Now go, sell the oil and pay your debts. You and your sons can live on what's left." Isn't that an amazing story? What is that in your hand? I remember when God said that to Moses, who was out in the middle of the wilderness in front of a bush that was burning and not consumed. He asked him, "Hey, what is that in your hand?" "Well, it's just a shepherd's staff, just a stick." "Throw it down." What can God do with a stick? What can God do with a little bit of oil in the bottom of a jar? What can God do with enough oil and flour to make a last piece of bread? But what does God want to teach us? You see, the widow had to give what she had in order to receive what God had. And you know, it always works that way. The reason that a lot of us don't experience God the way that we need to experience God is because our hands are already full with everything else. And God is saying, "Here's what I have for you," but there's no way that you can receive it when you're clutching onto what you already have. What we have to do is learn to let go of that so that we can receive what God has. Isn't that what Jesus taught us when he said, whoever wants to save his life will what? Will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake, he'll find it. What are we holding on to? What is God trying to teach us? Sometimes we can't hold what God has for us because our hands are already full of the things that we've provided for ourselves. We have to be generous in order to receive his generosity. Now, I want to go one step further because I have to ask myself, why would God use these poor people in distress as an illustration of his generosity in the Old Testament? Why would he do that? Well, because it becomes so clearly seen. What God wants us to see in the midst of that stark distress and poverty, God shows us the truth of what he's all about. Listen to this. If you don't hear anything else today, hear this. God has never been about the provision. We get all caught up in the provision. What am I going to receive from God? It's never been about the provision. It has always been about the provider. It's not about what I can get from the hand of God. It's about I get to hold on to the hand of God. Is that I get to be in relationship with him. And I get to know that he's there and that he loves me and that I can have an intimate, personal relationship with him. He wants you to see him. Not just what he provides, but him. It's always been about that. And as I look at these two stories of these two widows in such a desperate situation, it reminds me of how desperate my situation is. Oh, Jerry, you're not poor. Things are going great in your life. And you might say that about you too. Hey, things are going, no. If we could just see ourselves for a moment with our spiritual eyes instead of our physical eyes, instead of our worldly eyes, if we could perceive ourselves from the point of view of God, I want us to think about just how desperate and destitute and spiritually poor we are. But when we receive Jesus, we become rich beyond measure. Not the way the world measures it, but the way God measures it. Many of us, we continue in poverty, in spiritual poverty and distress because we cannot let go of the things that are around us. When if we would do that, if we would just open our hands and let those things fall to the ground, that God would be there to fill our lives up with the presence of his own Son. And do you know how I know that? Because that was the example he gave me when he sent Jesus to this earth, who had everything: the scepter, the crown, the throne, the power, heaven, and he left it all. He opened his hand and he dropped it all and made himself nothing so that God could give him a name that is above every name. That at the name of Jesus, every knee would bow and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of the Father. That's our example. So what is that in your hand? We're moving to a time of decision.